Pirates of the Caribbean opened in Disneyland Park in California in March of 1967. It was the last ride Walt himself oversaw the construction of before passing away in 1966. Originally, the ride was meant to be a walk-through wax museum until it changed to the fun boat ride it is today. The idea for the Pirates of the Caribbean movie was pitched in the early 1990s, but wasn't released in theaters until over 10 years later. Much to everyone's surprise, it became an instant hit and remains as one of the best action-adventure films to this day. My name is Matt from Cinema Brawls, and I'm here to talk to you all about how Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, is in our book, a perfect 10. Now, a bit of a disclaimer, there's no such thing as a perfect movie, and Pirates certainly isn't it. But with all the negativity on the internet regarding movies, it's good to focus on what's good about them. Curse of the Black Pearl was released on July 9th, 2003, and earned $654 million in the worldwide box office, surpassing its $140 million budget, and became the fourth highest grossing film of 2003. It stars Johnny Depp, Orlando Bloom, Keira Knightley, and Jeffrey Rush. It was nominated for 5 Oscars and won 38 other awards for things like its story, Depp's performance, and Hans Zimmer's musical score. Just like our other videos, I'm going to go over a few first impressions before we delve deeper into the specifics of what makes this movie so great. These are things that won't quite fit in with the other categories, but are worth mentioning nonetheless. To summarize, this movie has a lot going on underneath its face value. It gives exposition at the same time as delivering plot points, at the same time as building character. Everything that happens in this movie usually has 2 things going on at once. It's ruthless and brutal without being overly gory. It's very tactful in its brutality, humor, and action. It serves as a historical period piece that is accurate in small details while still staying true to its fiction roots. For example, the flag on the mast of the Black Pearl, shown in the opening scene, was a design used by real-life pirate Calico Jack. Also, pirates actually were branded with a letter P on their forearm, so officials could tell them apart, similar to how Captain Norrington does to Jack Sparrow. Dancing that line between fiction and nonfiction can often create plot holes, but not here. And it adapts parts from the actual ride it's based on incredibly well, unlike other things like Country Bears or Haunted Mansion. And something else I really liked about it was that it subverts the expectations of other pirate-themed movies. For example, Barbossa carries a monkey instead of a parrot. Rigetti has a glass eye instead of an eye patch. And lastly, everyone wants nothing to do with the treasure instead of everyone hunting it. Oh, and the zombie thing. It's hard not to talk about the Pirates movies without talking about its rocky beginnings. It's actually a big reason why this movie is as great as it is, because it caught everybody off guard. Absolutely no one wanted another movie about pirates. But the filmmakers persevered, and now it's one of the best movies of all time. Here's why no one wanted another pirate movie. Pirates as characters were popular back in the 1950s when handsome debonair-type actors were playing them, like Errol Flynn and Burt Lancaster. But let's be honest, they were only popular because they were basically cowboy western movies just on water, and westerns dominated the entertainment scene. As more and more people tried to create their own version of the trope, they became caricatures of themselves, becoming more over the top and fictional and less rooted in reality. Disney's own Peter Pan is partly to blame for this. As filmmakers started moving away from westerns and into the vast potential-filled world of science fiction, pirate movies, and historical period pieces in general, started to fade out of the media's attention as well. A few examples of this are the movies King David and Cutthroat Island. One is an epic, moving, historical period piece, and the other abruptly ended Gina Davis's career. Regardless of how you view these movies now, good or bad, they both flopped in cinemas simply because people weren't interested in them anymore. This is about the time when Pirates was first pitched to Disney by Jerry Bruckheimer and Dick Cook. They brought on a few screenwriters to develop a loose story, but it was denied immediately because it didn't seem like a very profitable project, and there were bigger fish to fry. In the year 2000, however, something important happened that would change the course of cinematic history and change the fate of Pirates of the Caribbean. Ridley Scott made the movie Gladiator. Whether or not Gladiator was a good movie is a subject for another video, but the point of the context in this video is that it was a very influential movie. It reintroduced to the world the possibility of a historical period movie being entertaining and profitable with the right combination of story and good actor performances. So in 2002, Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio were hired to develop a script for Pirates of the Caribbean and added a special twist to make it more marketable. They added undead pirates. Jerry Bruckheimer was brought back on board and got Gore Verbinski to direct. But the project got denied yet again. It's crazy to think that it was denied again, even though all the pieces were in place to make it a good investment. The reason for this is a man named Michael Eisner, the CEO of Disney at the time. He would stop production every chance he could because he was concerned about investors not taking interest in the project and the company suffering a big loss because of it. Disney already lost a lot of money because of the previous flops, like the abysmal attempt to make a movie based off of another park ride, The Country Bears. I know what you're thinking. It shouldn't all be about the money, but Eisner saw things differently. Before leaving Paramount Pictures to become the Disney CEO in 1981, Eisner wrote in a letter to the Paramount higher-ups saying, quote, "We have no obligation to make art. We have no obligation to make a statement. But to make money, it is often important to make history, to make art, or to make some significant statement. In order to make money, we must always make entertaining movies, and if we make entertaining movies, at time, we will reliably make history, art, a statement, or all three. We may even win awards." Close quote. Eisner made a lot of choices and sacrifices to make money, and more often than not, it hurt the reputation of the company in the long run. He was the one who severely downsized the Disney theme parks, repackaged old Disney classics as VHS to increase sales, made direct-to-video sequels, and even came up with the Disney Vault to make the classics a more marketable commodity. Oh, and he was behind the huge debacle that was Euro Disney. Say what you will about him though, because he also oversaw the wildly successful Disney Renaissance movies. Basically, Pirates was a huge risk from a business and creative standpoint, and it was stopped at almost every turn, even during actual filming. But if Pirates of the Caribbean is worth anything in the cinematic world, it's a testament to perseverance and taking risks. Taking risks can be a good thing. Just look at the MCU. It's a huge risk to create a connected cinematic universe franchise, and it works. People are always waiting to see what the next new thing is going to be, and we could all take a page out of Pirates' book when making films in the future. For those who haven't seen the film, you should. Here's a brief synopsis of the plot. In the early 1700s, the British were sailing to occupy a city called Port Royal in Jamaica. On the way there, a young Elizabeth Swann discovers Will Turner trying to perform a freestyle butterfly stroke in the water and not doing a good job with it. They rescue him and she pulls a gold pirate medallion off of him and keeps it, fearing that if Will kept it, he will become vain, and pirates will try to kill him. 8 years later, Captain Norrington proposes to Elizabeth on the same day he gets promoted to Commodore. After the ceremony, Norrington and Elizabeth stand as precariously as possible near a cliff, and Elizabeth starts to feel suffocated by the heavy-handed, high-societal metaphor that is her corset. She falls in the water, and the medallion she just happened to be wearing at the moment emits a bat signal when it hits the ocean. Lucky for her, Johnny Depp sailed into town that same morning and saves her, because his heart grew 2 sizes the previous Christmas. That night, the pirates of a mysterious ship called the Black Pearl attack Port Royal in search of the medallion and kidnap Elizabeth, knowing she has it. She lies and says she's related to Will, to keep them from knowing her father is the governor, but that just makes the pirates keep her for longer. They take her to the Isla de la Muerta, to use her blood to break a curse that makes them always hungry and look like death. Literally. Will attempts to get Norrington off his privileged feathery hat to rescue Elizabeth. He doesn't budge. Will then breaks Johnny Depp out of prison to rescue her himself. They steal a Navy ship and go to Tortuga to get a crew of their own to go after the Black Pearl. Meanwhile, deep within the cave with an alarming amount of treasure that no one seems to be paying attention to, Barbossa sacrifices a bit of Elizabeth's blood, but it doesn't work. Will knocks out Johnny Depp, worried he would double-cross him, and he eventually gets captured by Barbossa. Will and Elizabeth escape on the Interceptor, but it gets destroyed by the Black Pearl and they all get captured as well. Will makes a deal to let Elizabeth go, but Barbossa exploits a loophole to marine Elizabeth and Johnny Depp on an island. Elizabeth commits the unpardonable sin and burns the rum to create a smoke signal to attract the attention of the Navy. With Norrington's help, they go to the Isla de la Muerta to save Will. Johnny Depp shows off the skills he learned from an online close-up magic school and bests Barbossa in a duel. The curse is broken and the rest of the pirates, give up, I guess, and everyone is happy. Except for Johnny Depp, because he is tried and sentenced to hang back in Port Royal. But then Will helps him escape and then everyone is happy. With that out of the way, let's take a more in-depth look at some specific parts of the plot and explain why this story works. The opening sequence shows us Elizabeth rescuing Will Turner from the wreckage of another ship, and she sees the Black Pearl sailing away into the fog. She finds Will's gold medallion piece and then wakes up, revealing it to be a dream. This dream essentially sets in motion the entire plot. We notice that the medallion has been laying dormant in her drawer for a long time, and she only decides to put it on because of that dream. Because she puts it on, the Black Pearl knows where to find it, kidnaps her, Will goes to rescue her, and Jack just happens to be in the right place at the right time. Speaking of the medallion, I would argue that it is one of the best movie MacGuffins put to screen. It not only kicks off the plot of the movie, but consistently drives the plot forward without overtaking the plot. A good example of this would be the ring in The Lord of the Rings. It's the reason our main character is in this mess in the first place, and provides a lot of character development with it. It brings the story to the next location and the next plot point, but it's not the entire story. The ring explains Frodo's intentions and is the reason he goes from place to place, and we see it affect him on an emotional and physical level. Beside all of that, there's a better underlying story in Aragorn taking his rightful place as king. The medallion, like I mentioned before, is the reason everybody goes on this adventure, but there's a better story going on in Will and Elizabeth's relationship. Also, it has ties to Will's past that we see him try to forget, but eventually embrace, further developing his character. A bad example of a MacGuffin would probably be the lab in Ant-Man and the Wasp. Every choice a character makes has something to do with this lab, and the only way the plot moves forward is when someone steals it or uses it. Bottom line, the medallion is a good MacGuffin. Moving on, I love Jack's introduction in this movie. His boat is very telling of his character, boisterous and confident, without having any substance to back it up. As he passes the warning pirates sign, his reaction is a good indicator of how he views the Navy and how they view him. And that is good plot development. I also love how every interaction Jack has is both comedic but also important, unlike future installments where some jokes seem out of place and put in just for the sake of silly comedy. This movie often disguises exposition in the comedic bits, so the audience cares to listen, like when Jack talks to the guards at Port Royal, or whenever Pintel and Ragetti are on screen. This movie has really good tone, and it sets the mood well. There's a noticeable tone difference when the medallion hits the water, telling the audience something bad is going to happen. Next, we see the pirates attack Port Royal. I love how we get to see how the town is affected by the attack. We see innocent people being killed, while others look on in shock and awe at the destruction coming upon their homes and livelihoods. This is something I wish was more prevalent in other blockbuster films, like Infinity War, for example. We learn from the Black Panther film that Wakanda is a very busy, thriving city, But when Thanos' Outriders attack, we don't really get to see the town affected by this. The rest of the people were just conveniently evacuated beforehand. It's not a bad thing, and it doesn't really hurt these other movies, but the inclusion of this in Pirates really works in its favor. The last thing I want to mention in terms of the plot is I like how the curse is introduced slowly, building up and up until the terrifying moment Elizabeth discovers it head on. This suspense builds in us as the audience too, and we feel the same way she does. It makes her more relatable and the pirates more feared. There are essentially 4 main characters in this film: Will Turner, Elizabeth Swann, Jack Sparrow, and Captain Barbossa. For this section, I wanted to go through each one and just talk about how each one is introduced and how they develop over the course of the movie. They are admittedly generic at first glance, but after extensive research, I've come to find that the character development is some of the best I've seen in a movie. Let's get started. Will Turner. The first scene we see Will in is when he delivers the sword to Norrington. It's a 5-minute long sequence, and we get a really good understanding of who he is, what he wants, and what his relationship with Elizabeth in that time. We learn that he is proud of his work and is passionate about his dreams, but he's often forced to hide it because of his social class. He's also forced to hide his feeling toward Elizabeth for the same reasons, although they sort of come to the surface occasionally. Unfortunately, Will is aware of the pecking order and knows he can't be with her. Him handing over the sword to Norrington is symbolic of him handing Elizabeth over. We see him wrestle with his love for Elizabeth, but also wrestle with his past as a pirate. He eventually gives in to the pirate thing because he knows it's the only way to save Elizabeth. This is also evident in the sword scene. Will not owning up to his craftsmanship, but then admitting it later to Jack at the mill, is symbolic of him denying his past for so long and later accepting it as part of his identity. Elizabeth Swann. Elizabeth's character is heavy with symbolism, but she is admittedly the most generic of the 4. She starts out as a simple damsel in distress, but later comes into her own as a character who can choose and fend for herself. The most interesting thing about Elizabeth is her yearning for adventure. She knows her place in the social pecking order as well as Will, but insists on flirting with him a bit to upset the order, as it were. She has an extensive knowledge about pirates and their way of doing things, even though such knowledge wouldn't normally be a part of a girl of her stature. When she falls in the cove and Jack rescues her, he rips off her corset to save her life. I joked about this earlier. The corset is representative of the shackles of her high life. She desperately wants to break free from it, and the way she's able to do that is through Jack, by embracing pirate culture instead. It's also worth mentioning that her and Jack's names are of birds that reflect who they are. The swan is elegant and majestic, while a sparrow is free. Jack Sparrow. Jack was based on people I mentioned before, like Errol Flynn and Burt Lancaster, and was originally going to be played by people like Christopher Walken, Jim Carrey, Matthew McConaughey, and Hugh Jackman. Depp won an Oscar for his performance, which he based on Keith Richards. Depp figured that Jack Sparrow is kind of the washed-up rock star of the pirate world, so he decided to play him like a washed-up rock star of our day. Sorry, Keith Richards. I mentioned his entrance scene on the sinking dinghy. This detail is symbolic of how he views himself, certainly, but also what the rest of the world sees. Jack is a character archetype known as the trickster, a genius troublemaker who breaks the rules to suit himself and only ever does anything if it benefits him in the end. Another well-known trickster is Loki from the MCU. We end up asking ourselves during the film, are we really meant to believe anything Jack says? Even his tales of grandeur from the past, like escaping an island by tying 2 sea turtles together with his back hair? The answer is no. We are absolutely not supposed to trust him. We know his escape story is fake, and then Jack is basically the Gilderoy Lockhart of pirates. He just happens to be in the right place at the right time, and he takes the magnificent stories for himself. We see some of Jack's actual plans succeed and some fail, and even after we know he's a fraud, we see him try again. We really get a sense of his desperation of trying to save his own skin, but also not leaving everyone else to die. He becomes more of a hero who's willing to sacrifice himself by the end of the film. Captain Barbossa. Barbossa is an exceptional villain in style, motive, and execution. Apparently, Geoffrey Rush was a nightmare to work with because he cared too much about the role, constantly calling the director to ask about the tiniest little niche. Barbossa and the rest of the Black Pearl are considered sympathetic villains. They are evil, for sure, but they have a true motive that we as an audience can get behind. They just want to return the gold and become human again. The heroes don't lose anything if the villains get their wish. Well, except maybe Jack and the Pearl. Elizabeth is shocked to discover they didn't need to kill her, they just needed a drop of her blood. It's only after the pirates feel double-crossed that they do more treacherous acts. Barbossa preaches something called retributive justice, also known as an eye for an eye in the Bible. He feels his punishment didn't match the crime, but we all know it did. Their greed is what led to them being unable to quench their earthly desires. An endless wanting of things matches their greed. As mentioned before, this movie is far from perfect and definitely has its flaws. However, every movie has flaws. I'd like to just take a moment to discuss a few of the big glaring issues that this movie has. Apparently, the medallions can affect light, but it doesn't really get explored later. This could have been a cool detail to include later in the film somehow, but it would be tricky to pull off. If they couldn't replicate it a second time later, I don't think they should have messed with it to begin with. As mentioned before, Elizabeth has an extensive knowledge about pirates and about the code itself. But how does she come to know all of this in the first place? Pirates and anything about them are illegal. I doubt there's just a section about pirates at the Port Royal Library. How did Gibbs go from being with the British Navy to a drunken pirate in Tortuga? He clearly is aware of the code more than anyone else and knows Jack very well. There's just so much we don't know, and there must be some kind of story to explain all of this, but I have to wonder, would it even matter? Is that really a story that needs to be told? Technically, wouldn't they have needed Elizabeth's blood anyway? Is it the blood of anyone who takes the coins, or is it just the blood of those who took it out of the chest originally? I guess those rules just don't make total sense to me. And lastly, and this is the kicker, can the cursed pirates feel pain or not? They obviously can't die because Barbossa and a few others get full-on stabbed without flinching. But then there are other scenes where they get hit, stabbed, burned, or knocked overboard and scream as if they're in pain. Doesn't make a ton of sense and is honestly the most inconsistent thing in this movie. Just as you can't talk about the Pirates movies without its rocky beginnings, you also have to talk about what the Pirates movies have offered since the first outing. This movie as a whole brings up the theory of consequentialism. It's an ethical theory that says human actions derive their moral worth solely from their outcomes or consequences. It's doing bad things to achieve a greater good, like Robin Hood stealing from the rich to give to the poor, or the Suicide Squad being bad people doing something bad to prevent something worse. This movie dances on the line of this philosophy, making us cheer for the lying, cheating Jack and rooting against the straight-laced Navy. If someone does something bad for the greater good, does that really make them bad? This idea has stuck in people's minds since, and other movies have adapted this philosophy into their own films. A lot of the reason for this is because of the risks Pirates of the Caribbean took in its approach to storytelling. If they had the generic good-looking guy doing the generic stunts, this movie as a whole would be generic. But they had a washed-up rock star anti-hero, an admittedly generic love interest, but who had risky motives, undead pirates, etc. The second movie took just as many risks, I would say, focusing on the mystical qualities of Jack's compass that doesn't point north, and introducing one of the best villains ever in Davy Jones. The downside is those risks have now become the generic thing, and everyone seems to be just a caricature of themselves. The initial problem that led to there almost not being a Pirates of the Caribbean in the first place. Will Turner seems to always just be chasing Elizabeth. Elizabeth became more and more distant from her high-class roots in outrageous ways, and Jack went from being an amazing supporting character anti-hero to the unsuspecting main hero of it all. Johnny Depp used to ad-lib most of his lines and would call the director all the time about his crazy ideas for the character, but now in the latest installment he has to be fed lackluster quips through an earpiece. Davy Jones was even reduced to the East India Trading Company's side lackey in the third one. Everything that was great about the first two movies suddenly became the norm, and they couldn't keep thinking of new ways to top it. The later movies focused on just the pirates, when the first one was just as much about them as it was about Port Royal and the Navy. The chest had some historical ties to it and could technically be legit, but then they throw all caution to the wind and search for the all-magical Poseidon's trident. And after they decided to get rid of Will and Elizabeth entirely, turning the focus to Jack, the Pirates franchise saw a departure from what made the first one so truly great. Penelope Cruz was nothing more than a pretty face. The mermaids make no sense, and the fifth installment retreated entirely and brought back Will and Elizabeth, but also they weren't technically Will and Elizabeth. Also, let's bring back Barbossa for some reason, in an element he clearly doesn't belong. And then there's some ghost ship, and then they went ahead and said, oh, why don't we just destroy all magic entirely, because we've dug ourselves too deep in the supernatural hole and this is the only way to get out. I'm sorry, I'm getting off topic. Even though the franchise as a whole has been declining more and more, the first one had a unique style and a unique approach to storytelling, to the point it was good enough to spark a franchise in the first place. To wrap things up, I just want to stress how much of a risk Pirates of the Caribbean was, from its troubled production, to the decisions of casting, the changes from usual movie making, and its power that has helped these characters truly stand the test of time. It was a fresh take on pirates, historical period pieces, and provided a unique tone and style other movies have emulated since then. And for these reasons, we believe Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl to be a perfect 10. Do you agree? What changes would you have made to the Pirate sequel so they would better live up to the first one? Comment below and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. I've been Matt, this has been Cinema Brawls. Thanks for watching.